Today, we become legends.
Hey, my name's Zinta, welcome back to the channel, and today we have some Smite data to look at. We've got some heat maps here for player damage distribution, as well as player kill locations, and also some farming ones from Innocent Rabbit as well, here. So we've got a bunch of different ones to look at, and full credit to Tom Burge and Innocent Rabbit. High-Res Rabbit, he's now been recruited by High-Res, he does their data stuff, which I think is really cool. But yeah, full credit to these two guys for creating these maps. I would honestly have no idea how to even go about gathering the data for this stuff. I'm very interested in the data, but I do not have the skills and know how to gather this stuff manually. So for them to put together these visualizations that I can go over, I think is really cool of them. So go follow Tom Burge and Innocent Rabbit on Twitter and Reddit. They post very interesting stuff, especially Innocent Rabbit. He's the high-res data guy. He posts like high-res data stuff all the time. I think he recently put out like that there's 1 in 5 games has a neath in it or something like that, which is kind of insane. So he has cool stuff like that over on his Twitter, so make sure you go follow him over there. But yeah, getting into these, first up we have player damage distribution across the entire game on the Conquest map. And we can basically see that mid lane is completely lit up here. There's a little bit going on in the side lanes as well in terms of player damage, but for the most part, most of the damage in your average game. This is from 50 random Grandmaster and Masters games, by the way, in patch 10.11. You can see that the vast majority of the fighting, or at least the vast majority of the player damage, is happening around mid, you know, around that beacon or just around the mid lane in general. But a more useful way to look at it, I think, is this next slide, which I guess I will open in a new tab to get you guys a bit of a better view of it. So this one essentially separates it into pre-10 minutes, 10 to 20 minutes, and post-20 minutes. So essentially early game, mid game, and late game from left to right here. And you can see that the maps look very different, which is why I think that other one is like, it's useful, but it's not as useful in terms of explaining, you know, what you should be doing in the early game and the mid game and the late game. So here in the early game, we can see that actually a vast majority of the player damage is happening in the side lanes. Mid lane's actually not that active in the first 10 minutes. It's more so of just like farming, you know, rotating to other camps and stuff like that. Mid laners generally not sat in their lane quite as much as solo laners and ADCs, and especially in the duo lane pre-10 minutes, you know, a lot of that is going to be coming from supports and ADCs both boxing in that lane. And so that's why it has like the most total damage in the pre-10 minute period, but also solo lane comes very close with that. Solo lane actually has more of these white squares, you know, right in the middle of the lane near the totem and the silver buff. We got a lot of player damage happening there, you know, where waves clash basically. But then moving into the mid game, we see that mid lane basically comes alive. This is pretty much the map that we saw in the first one. All the fighting happening around mid, 2 white squares on beacon here, 2 white squares, or 3 in like the middle of the mid lane as well. Mid lane is the central point of the map. It's the closest to the most amount of objectives. You know, you're close to Gold Fury, you're close to Fire Giant, you're close to Beacon, you're close to a lot of the buffs. It makes sense that a lot of the fighting would happen around here in the mid game, and we all know that like in the mid game, you know, you've got your mid, your jungle, and your support often grouping up as a 3 and sort of looking for skirmish fights around mid. Maybe you'll have some rotations from side laners, which is probably why a lot of the damage falls off from these. You know, solo laners and even ADCs to a certain extent will start rotating in this period of the game. And then in the late game, we can see that it basically becomes the mid and Fire Giant show. A lot of mid, basically all of mid is lit up in dark red here with like a good amount of damage happening there, around like 300 to 400 per cell here. And then also around Fire Giant is basically the same story. And that's no surprise to anyone. You know, everyone that's played Conquest and more than a few games knows that the post 20 minutes late game is almost entirely focused around who can get the Fire Giant. And being centered around mid, you know, also helps you get that beacon, but you're also close to Fire Giant, you're close to Gold Fury if that's spawning or whatever. Mid lane will just always be the hub of activity in Smite. It's just how the map is designed. There's no way to like fix that, and I don't think it's a problem, to be honest. We can also see like a big amount of fighting down at this mid Phoenix on the order side. I imagine that is just an artifact of how small the sample size is here. 50 games might sound like a good sample size, but in terms of this amount of data, you really do want a sample size larger than that. I'm not blaming Dr. Burge for this. I don't think he does this for his job or anything. He's just a guy that loves Smite and wanted to make some infographics on it and stuff, so I definitely don't blame him for not wanting to, you know, do 1,000 games as a sample size, because I imagine this data was probably very tedious to collect. You know, maybe the Chaos side won the majority of the games that he took the sample from, and so there's a lot of fighting around the order side mid Phoenix because they were sieging from the Chaos side, so I think that's probably where that comes from. I would ignore that for the most part and just see that generally mid lane and Fire Giant is where you want to be in the late game in terms of fighting. We also have player kill locations, which is similar but not quite exactly the same as the player damage thing. You can see here that, yeah, mid is still an absolute lit up beacon. I mean, that's where the beacon is, right? Mid lane is pretty much the beacon beacon of light here in terms of like a lot of kills are happening around this very central portion of the map between the two mid towers and the beacon. Some is still happening in the side lanes, slightly more in duo lane than in solo lane, which I guess kind of makes sense. Solo lanes are tanks and they generally will have, you know, less kill potential overall than they will in the duo lane, but it's not by much. Basically all of this fighting is happening around mid. And then if we move over to the early, mid, and late game maps, we can see the pre-10 minutes, yeah, that most of the fighting and kills is happening in the side lanes, but there's also quite a lot of happening in mid as well. I think there's generally less damage in the mid lane in the early game, but there's a similar amount of kills. And I think that the less damage is just because, like, the fights that happen around mid, they are fights. People are looking for kills, whereas a lot of the time in the side lanes, you're going to be having things where, you know, people are just trading damage back and forth, especially in solo lane, but even in the duo lane, especially in the early game, people are just trading damage back and forth. They're not even necessarily looking for kills. They're just looking to push people out and make them lose farm, because, like, in the early game, pushing someone back to base is almost as good as a kill. In the mid game, we can see that it basically becomes the mid and duo side jungles show. Gold Fury comes online around this time. I mean, it comes online in the early game, but you'd very rarely check in Gold Fury pre-10 minutes unless you're like completely snowballing and stomping the enemy team. But yeah, a lot of fights around Beacon, a lot of fights around mid, and a lot of fights around Gold Fury and duo lane as well. And then in the late game, it's very similar to the player damage scenario. The entirety of mid and the entirety of the right side jungle around Fire Giant is basically the hotspot. Again, we can kind of see that artifacting of like a lot more kills are happening in the Order side base than are happening in the Chaos side base. Don't take anything from that. It will purely be the low sample size of 50 games. You know, maybe 30 of these games were won by Chaos, but 20 of them were won by Order, and that's probably why this happens. But yeah, moving on to Innocent Rabbit's heat maps. These ones are gold income location by role, based on low MMR versus high MMR. So it's 1500 versus 2500 plus, so essentially silver versus masters. And first up is mid here, which we can see that in general, not too much is different between low MMR and high MMR mid laners, other than in general, I would say the mid is getting a little bit more farm from more camps in the higher levels than they are in the lower levels. So generally in lower level, it seems like people are just kind of sitting in mid and farming, you know, maybe they're clearing a wave and then they're just waiting for the next wave, whereas like a masters mid lane player will always be like, oh, I've cleared the wave, I have nothing to do, what else can I go do now? Can I go farm this red buff where they're getting slightly more farm than the silver players are? Can I go farm the green buff? Can I go farm the mid camps? Can I go farm my speed and back camps with my jungler and split that maybe, because splitting is efficient? And so you're seeing a lot more of that in the higher levels of mid lane play versus in the lower levels of mid lane play. So you can actually learn a lot from these infographics. I think they're really cool. Huge credit to Innocent Rabbit and Dr. Burge for creating these. I think they're very interesting. I couldn't do this myself, but I can provide some commentary on it at least. And yeah, it seems like the big difference between low level and high level mid laners is that ability to, you know, always be farming something. You know, if your wave is down, if you just cleared your wave and you don't think you can have like kill potential on the enemy mid or something, go farm a camp. And Masters players know that, and that's why they're getting a little bit more from these far-flung camps. You know, you can see that speed buff and back harpies are pretty much non-existent for a silver mid laner, but for a Masters mid laner, they're splitting those with their jungler fairly often. Moving on to solo laners though, I would say this is similar but a little bit different. You can see that in silver, there's a little bit more farm coming from like far-flung locations of the map. Like silver solo laners are farming like speed buff and red buff a lot more, and they're even getting a little bit of farm from mid lane as well, whereas the master solo laners, there isn't really too much. There's a tiny splodge in mid where like probably fights just happen and you get a lot of farm from like kills that happen in mid. That's probably where most of that comes from. But you can also see that in general, the blue buff is a larger portion of a silver solo laner's farm than it is for a master solo laner. It's not by a massive difference, but I think this is indicative of the fact that like silver solo laners don't really know how to farm super effectively, and that is a big difference in being like a better Smite player. You know, your mechanical skill and your god knowledge and all that stuff is very important, but having the ability to farm more effectively than your opponent can make up for a massive like mechanical skill diff. And you can see that Silver's blue buff is slightly more lit up than Master's blue buff. That's not because Silvers are taking their blue buff more efficiently or anything. I think it is because they're getting less farm in total, and so their blue buff, which is probably secured at about the same rate as a Master's player anyway, is a larger percentage of their total farm, if you get what I mean by that. Moving into support, which is of course one of the roaming roles, so we see a lot more of the map lit up in general here. You can see that a majority of their farm does come from the duo lane, you know, especially because in that early game, you know, duo lane is a duo lane for the early game, so support is going to be getting a lot of farm while they're splitting it with their ADC in there. The gold chests have been lit up for all the previous maps, as you can see. They're lit up on the solo lane map a little bit here. And also, even for solo lane, you can see that a larger percentage of their farm is coming from this free gold than it is for a Masters player. Not by a massive amount, but there is a little bit there. And then for supports, you can see as well that a lot of their farm is coming from this gold chest camp because supports get less farm in general. So this area is going to be more lit up on the support graph because it's a larger percentage of their total farm that they're getting from these free gold chests. And what I would say about the difference here between Silver and Masters in support is that it's way more focused. You can see in Masters that, like, they are getting their farm from very specific sources. It's this central part of mid lane, it's the objectives, it's dual lane for the early game, and then obviously the chest camp. Whereas with Silver, you can see that they just kind of spread out across the entire map. They're getting a lot of farm from solo that they really aren't getting in Masters. I would say that, yeah, as a support, hanging around in solo probably isn't your best idea. A support and a solo probably can't kill a solo anyway because they're too tanky and stuff like that. And you should generally be in places that is more, like, reachable for the objectives and stuff like that. If you're in solo lane, yes, you're close to Fire Giant, but you're miles from Gold Fury and pretty far from Beacon and stuff, so you would generally want to hang around, like, mid or maybe even dual lane for the, you know, first 10 to 15, 20 minutes when Gold Fury is more of a priority. Of course, you do want to start hanging around Fire Giant a lot more in the late game and stuff like that, but it seems that Silver supports generally just walk around trying to get farm wherever, and that Masters players are sort of more focused on where they want to get their farm. Moving into ADC, we can see a general trend, actually. It's similar with supports. In Silver, there is a lot of, like, farm coming from mid, even a little bit coming from solo, where solo is completely non-existent for ADCs in the Masters level of play. And you can also see, again, that, like, a larger portion of their gold is coming from, like, their purple buff, or, like, these mid camps, or the chest camp, or green buff that has no markings on it whatsoever in the Masters, but has, like, a pretty significant one in Silver. So, again, you can kind of see that, like, it's a little bit less focused. ADCs in Silver are just kind of like, yes, they still get the majority of their farm from their lane, but they're just kind of like walking around, taking random camps, spending way too much time in mid by the looks of it. Whereas the Masters players, basically all of their farm is coming from this tiny little square here, between the middle of the lane and their enemy's tier 1 tower. That's where, like, basically all of their farm is coming from, and the gold buff as well. Gold buff is very high priority as well. But yeah, generally just more focused. They know where their farm is. They know how to get the most amount of farm the most efficiently without, like, wandering over to mid and getting farm, which is what, like, Silver seem to be doing based on this heat map. And they're also just getting more farm in general. The gold chest camp is a good, like, benchmark for how much farm each role is getting. So you would see that, like, in support, it is very lit up, like, kind of almost yellow or at least orange, whereas with the ADCs, at least in Masters anyway, is completely brown. And so you can see that, like, even though they're getting the same amount of gold roughly from this treasure chest, you know, regardless of the player or the role or anything like that, you can see that it's much lower here, and that is because ADCs in general get more farm than support, so this makes less of an impact on the heat map. And finally, we have the jungle role, the most, you know, roaming of the roles, I suppose, and you can see that, you know, most of their farm is not coming from lanes here. They'll be getting a little bit from mid, especially in high level play. It seems like junglers split a little bit more mid farm in high level play than they do in low level play based on this. And also, you can just see the sheer farm difference, I feel like. Silver junglers, you know, they're getting a little bit of, like, deep red on a lot of these camps, but not really any yellow or orange, except for on their specific speed buff on the right-hand side here. Whereas Masters junglers, basically all of their camps have a little bit of orange on them, except for maybe the gold chests, which again, as I mentioned, you know, gold chests are a flat amount of income regardless of your role. So if this is more lit up, it means your role is getting less farm. If this is less lit up, it means your role is getting more farm. But yeah, you can see the junglers are just a lot more efficient. They're also invading a lot more. You see splodges on every single enemy camp, some of them even going into the red, whereas on the silver one, there's pretty much no splodges on a lot of these camps, and if anything, they're just dark brown, so like a lot less farm being gained from invades than it is in higher level jungle play. But yeah, I just thought this video would be interesting. Again, full credits to Hi-Rez Rabbit and to Dr. Burge for creating these graphs. I could not do it myself. I just thought I would bring some commentary on it for a video, because this really interests me, this kind of data in Smite. I don't know if it interests you guys. This video might do terribly. I don't know who's actually interested in this stuff, but I am, personally. I thought I would make a video on it. I think they're very good for illustrating, you know, what you should be doing, especially these ones with, like, the 3, where you can see, like, the early game, the mid game, and the late game, and the sheer difference in the amount of, like, player kill density and damage in these, and where that is happening. It can kind of give you an indication of, like, what you should be doing in the early game versus the mid game versus the late game. You know, you can see that laning is a big priority in the early game, and then in the mid game, it becomes, like, centered around mid and Gold Fury, and then the late game, it becomes centered around mid and Fire Giant. I think a lot of people that play Conquest, you know, for a significant amount of time will know these basic rules, but I think it's still useful to see like where a lot of the action is happening on the map, and also in terms of the innocent rabbit ones, like where your farm is coming from and what roles can get, you know, farm, where they can get it, that kind of stuff. But yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I thought it was very interesting, and I will catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.